New myth, old God, and the origin of heaven and hell on earth. Myth is from a Greek word, mythos, which means speech, thought, story, and myth like a legendary story for influencing an audience. So myth means a story. Specifically, a myth is a story told for the purpose of influencing an audience, whether or not that purpose is recognized or even admitted. Even more specifically, myth could mean almost any sequence of words. We can contrast myths with other sequences of words, like a simple list of different colors, red, white, and blue, which does not qualify as a story, right? So a sequence of words isn't necessarily a myth, but if it's a story, that kind of a sequence of word that is a story for influencing an audience, well, that's a myth. As an example of a myth, I could tell a story about a character named Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, or Saint Nick, etc., who once upon a time met some children and bribed them by promising them a pleasant surprise in the near future. So the story I could tell about Santa Claus might be influential, whether or not any particular element of the story is already popular or famous or familiar or accepted as the truth. So I could call the story a metaphor. I could call it a parable. I could call it a teaching tool. I could call it a joke. I could call it a legend. I could call it an anecdote, or just call it a story or myth. Even if a story is labeled entirely true by some particular labeler, the telling of the story could still be for producing some result by influencing an audience. Just because the story might contain elements that are perceived to be true by the audience, that doesn't mean it can't be for. That doesn't mean that the story can't be told for producing some result in terms of influencing an audience, whether that's a commercial advertisement or a curriculum of a class or anything like that. So since there may be no other reason for speaking except to promote certain results through influence, any story could be a myth. Any sequence of words for the purpose of influencing an audience is a story and a myth, as distinct from just a list of words like red, white, blue, brown, beige, and so on, which could be put into a story and could be for influencing an audience. But let's pretend that there's some sequences of words that aren't myths, or let's consider that perhaps there are some sequences of words, some speech acts, some words that by themselves are just words and they're not myths. They're not for influencing. And I'm not sure what that would mean, what they would be for, even just a single word like no or yes. So, if some people doubt or even reject the literal references of a story, that story can still be a myth, right? Say, for instance, the Santa Claus story about bribing children with the promise of future rewards and stuff. So if some people believe the literal references of some story, the story can still be a myth. Believing it, doubting it, rejecting it, those don't change the fact that it could be a myth. If some people even argue over a story, the story can be a myth still. Is Luke the correct gospel or Matthew? They are not entirely consistent. One leaves out things, the other adds. There's some certain, there's different translations. Which is the true one? Which is the best one? Well, all translations are fundamentally translations. So, hundreds of millions or even millions of people could go to war based on a particular story, like about Santa Claus or whatever. hundreds, even millions of people could go to war with each other after hearing stories and then practicing, refining, and rehearsing those stories. Somebody makes up a story, somebody tells it, hears it, writes it, reads it, then it gets practiced, refined, rehearsed, modified, elaborated, exaggerated, parts get left out, parts get added. Soon there's a war. These stories, or maybe soon there's a new revolution politically, or a new technology and a new cultural trend. So, stories may or may not be completely true, but that may not even be really especially important to people who are exposed to a particular story, Santa Claus or whatever. Some people may be more eager to argue or launch an attack and start a war than to research the details of a particular story, or they want to pour money into a particular campaign or project, want to start a new business based on a story. So some people may be more eager to make a certain purchase or cast a certain vote for a certain candidate than to question the stories that are motivating, organizing, and producing those actions. Stories are what motivates, organizes, and produces action. So people organize their time based on stories. People organize their behavior based on stories. People organize their finances. People organize everything based on stories. However, perhaps only a few people may be curious to explore the stories that inform or form or regulate their patterns of behavior and the results produced by those patterns of behavior that rule the results they experience. So mythology is the study of stories told for the purpose of influencing an audience. Mythology is the study of influential stories, such as the curriculum of a class or a commercial advertisement. Studying the art of storytelling and the art of influence or communication is one possible meaning of the word mythology. It's a several hundred-year-old word. Again, the study of is the logi part at the end of mythology, and then the beginning is from that Greek word mythos, for speech, thought, story, myth, could also be concept. In summary, a myth is an influential story. So a new myth would be any influential story that is unfamiliar. It's new. The following is a new myth about an old god. Once upon a time, there was an old god. The god had been around for a very long time, even longer than any of the stories about the old god. The god was so old that the god was called eternal, since the god was older than any stories about the god, all of which were actually invented by the god, who also invented language, which is the components out of which a story was formed by the god. And then the god formed another story, and then another one, a newer myth, another story. So one old story about the god called the god by the name Indra. This story was one of the oldest stories about God. Indra was also called Huta, which meant the invocation. By the way, invocation basically means an influential sequence of words, such as a myth. Invocation, declaration, creation, claiming. So that old word from the Sanskrit language, Huta, was eventually written in some recent alphabet as Huta, Huta, which was later modified into other words like Guta and Gut and Guth and Got and Got and God. So the word God was first formed a little over 1,000 years ago. But even before that word was formed, other similar words were formed like Indra and Allah and Jehovah and Yahweh and Buddha and Tao and Saturn and Set and Loki and El, Aramis, Adonis. God comes from Goth, Guth, Gut, Old Irish Gut for voice. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. and ultimately from Sanskrit gut and huta, which is a epithet or another name for Indra, the supreme being, the divinity, the divine presence, the eternal, holy, perfect, pure I am. So God is a relatively new word, just over 1,000 years old, representing a very old idea. God has to do with invocation and voice and authority and authoring, as in the creating of distinct experiences through variations in speaking. Variations in speaking. For instance, in one influential story, God declares a distinction between heaven and earth. Earth is the realm of external experience. External experience, as in subjective perception. That out there is the earth. Heaven is in here, within. The kingdom of heaven is within, said Jesus. Heaven is the realm of internal experience, as in conception or concepts or conceiving or creating or identifying or labeling or relating to or organizing, regulating, ruling. So it is said that as above, so below. That means that as in heaven, so on the earth. Whatever is formed in heaven will be reflected in earth, an earthly experience. So this means that the realm of earthly experience is a product of or a partner of a heavenly conceiving, as in the immaculate conceiving. God speaks things into existence as the reality or realm or kingdom of experience, existence, right? The realm of heaven or kingdom of God is the authority of language or the reality of myth, the priority or primacy or dominance of invocation. So after all, I said reality of myth. So after all myths are a distinct part of reality, right? The reality of myth, the actuality of words and labels and stories for influencing. Myths are a distinct part of reality, right? They're within the realm of language, specifically when you put a sequence of words together for influencing others. That would be a myth, right? So myths are real stories that can be really influential. Myths are the origins of identity and experience. Myths are tools for training audiences in a particular way to relate to life. Training audiences in this particular way to relate to life. Which way? This way I'm about to tell you. For instance, one way to relate to life is to identify particular elements of life, to repress, suppress as shameful or evil or sinful or forbidden or even incurable problems. Since I personally do not recognize any possible solution already, then obviously it is not possible that anyone would ever recognize a possible solution. No solution is possible, so the problem is labeled incurable, which could be just a reflection of my ignorance of the operation of physiology or psychiatry or language when I call something incurable and believe it is incurable because I labeled it incurable, because I don't know how to cure it, or at least I claim not to know how to cure it. So anyway, we've got all these things that are the bad things, the wrong things, the evil things. Anyway, once we have declared some sacred taboos as the negative, the forbidden, then there could be particular patterns of behavior identified that one can take to compensate for those shameful realities, those incurable problems, as in earning one's way into heaven from out of hell. That is the myth of living in hell already because of some original sin. There's always that justification or rationalization. That's why you're eternally living in hell because of that original sin in the past. It's a way of relating to the past, which gives us the present experience of hell. That's one way of relating based on a myth. So that's a perfectly valid story to tell, right? That story of hell, or here's some things that are wrong with reality and we should suppress and inhibit them. It's perfectly valid. I mean, certainly behavior can be influenced by that kind of story, right? Certain behaviors can be labeled as negative and suppressed and inhibited, and that can work. It can minimize and reduce those behaviors. There's other things that can be identified as the right way to be, and the solution, the compensation, the path to heaven, and people can be influenced to take those actions through these myths. So there are other stories that one could tell, but that myth of hell is a very popular one. The myth that we're in hell now because something's wrong within each of us and out there in the earth and the world in our experience. We find problems, and they're incurable, and they're shameful and evil and wrong and sin. There's all that sin out there. So that's the myth of hell. It's a very popular myth. Another related story is that there is a God who does not condemn any perception or pattern. This is Santa Claus, Indra, Father Christmas. There can be lots of names for this God, but it's a very popular story. There is a God who does not condemn any perception or pattern, but recognizes the reality of something called innocence. The reality of something called innocence, like an innocent mistake. There's all these innocent mistakes. There's just a particular way of labeling things as automatic, reflexive, reactive, innocent mistake. Totally optional. God forgives. That's what the story of God often would indicate, is God is the one who forgives stuff. God forgives things that other people resent, blame, shame, all that. God says things like, if there seems to be a problem with someone else's perception, remove the identifying of that problem from your own perception. If I see someone else's situation, I say it's a problem, I can recognize that as me labeling something else a problem. I can remove or discontinue the identifying of that problem from my own perception. I can stop identifying my own perception as a problem. Oh, I perceive that perception out there, over there, that person, that event, that process, it's a problem. I can see that that's just me relating to it and labeling it, and stop. So stop relating to the rest of reality as a set of problems. God doesn't relate to reality as a bunch of problems. God isn't anxious and agonizing and ashamed. God doesn't relate to reality as shameful. There's at least stories or myths about a God that does not relate to reality as a set of insurmountable problems. That God creates reality. So God might say, stop relating to the rest of reality as a set of problems. Start some introspection. Remove the blindness and filters from your own perception first. Notice your own perspective and how it influences your perception. And then perhaps you can assist others in removing any perception of problems from their own perspective. If they experience shame or rage or agonizing, once I am clear on the reality of how to experience shame and suffering and agonizing and rage, once I'm clear on how to produce those experiences as a result, then I can talk to other people about discontinuing the behavior of shaming reality and agonizing as a way of life. and raging as a way of relating to life. So remember, the perspective is the source of the perception. From the perspective comes the perception. From heaven comes the earthly experience, from the realm of heaven within. So if there's a perception of a problem, that comes from a perspective that identifies problems. The perception of a problem is a way of relating to something as in identifying myself in relation to it. I'm the one who has the problem. There's the problem. I have it. I'm stuck with it. It's a problem. I'm a victim. Something needs to be fixed. Something needs to be cured. Something needs to be compensated, changed, reformed, refined. Now, if I have a hunger for vitamin C, I could call that an incurable scurvy, or I could call that a hunger for vitamin C. So, are myths problems? Are language, is language a problem? Is the influential stories that we have been told and that other people are telling, are those problems? Once we see the reality of myths, we are not vulnerable to myths in the way that a naive child might be, a gullible child that doesn't know anything about Santa Claus and how adults lie to bribe children to influence their behavior and so on. So, to an adult, is it a problem that some people influence the behavior of others through myths like Santa Claus? Myths aren't really problems. Myths are myths. And myths are the source of the experience and labeling of problems. So in other words, are influential stories problems? Are myths problems? Are influential stories problems? Is influence a problem? Is communication a problem? Given that really all communication is influential, right? That's the point of it. If it's not influential, it's not effective communication, right? So are influential stories just real influential stories? Real myths? Real influence? Real stories? Real communication? They're not really problems. They're just stories that create the experience of problems as a way to relate to reality. So, which is more important? To save the world from the problem of influential stories, or to study the reality of influential stories, to study mythology, so that one is clear that relating to influential stories as a problem is just one of many valid ways to identify or label myths. We could label myths as a problem. We could label influential stories as shameful or sinful or incurable or sinful or evil. Whichever story you tell, that is the story you will experience. Unless you know that it's just a story. And once you know that a story is just a story, then you might not tell any at all, or you might tell all of them. In fact, that may be what you've been doing all along.